Hey there, this is podcast number 2 in this API Gateway podcast series. In the last one, I gave you some introduction and context to the problem. Let me pick up from where I left off in this one, right? So we talked about the endpoints being available and providing some value. So we have the endpoints now that power our systems. Now we want to publish them so other people can consume. What do we need to do? Initially, the first thought would be, hey, you have all of the business functionality implemented and the API already does that. All the endpoints collectively provide that value. How hard can it be to get it out there, right? Well, it depends, just like everything else. Here's what it takes us, right? It has taken us so far and we have about 15% more to go. One is, the more the number of endpoints, the more the work is going to be, right? It's reasonable, but that's not exactly true because we want to, though we have 375 endpoints that we're going to expose and publish in our first API, we want to make sure that our work was the endpoint agnostic, right? So meaning there could be some items that increase because the volume of these endpoints increases, but we didn't want 90% of what we're doing to be impacted or driven by the size of the number of these endpoints, because if that were to be the case, adding more and more, it's going to make it more and more challenging, right? So that was one of our requirements actually that we gave ourselves, one of the most high level requirements, right? So the first thing we did was we created a gateway application, right? So we have, it is on Amazon AWS. So we created a gateway, so it's based using lambdas and serverless computing and whatnot. Our API runs out of our own existing servers. You're going to deploy new ones for the purpose of this API gateway. And the actual AWS API gateway is going to be talking to this, right? So as a client, like if you're building something, let's say first thing is you're a developer, this is what your end user experience. I'm just going to jump the gun and give you the end user experience and come back to some of what I was going to say earlier, right? So you're going to go to a Postman workspace. You're going to check out or download the Postman workspace with all of these endpoints defined. The first challenge there is how we organize those endpoints, right? So when you have 5 of them, you can put it in one directory, name them, and you're done. When you have so many of those, how do you go about doing them? That's the first challenge. I'll list out these challenges and then we can get into how we resolved and addressed each of these challenges, right? That's why this is video 2 of N, not like 2 of 2. So you have to essentially come up with a list of directories. How do you nicely categorize and organize the endpoints so your the developer experience is actually enhanced, right? So if you the first option, even if it's like a silly option, it's nonetheless an option, that is to put every single endpoint in one directory, in one collection. That's at a flat list essentially, right? It works and you can number them, but it's very difficult to navigate and maneuver, right? It's almost like saying you have a code base with a single directory with every file sitting in it, right? For the exact same reason, you need to make it more accessible, more presentable, more usable, right? So your developer can consume it easily. So the first challenge is, how do we go about organizing this? We have a certain way we organize these endpoints already, right? For us to implement them internally. So for our apps, we use Insomnia, which is a different tool which supports Graph and REST quite gracefully. And personally, I'm a huge fan. I've been using them since I think it went live. It was a small company. I'm pretty sure it's still a small company. If you haven't checked them out, I highly recommend that you check that tool out. It's a pretty good tool. So, and maybe someone else purchased the company or something recently, I don't know. So we use Insomnia and we have it organized in a slightly different manner to satisfy our internal needs. And again, we built these features, we went live, and then we built a lot of these features, did a lot of enhancements. So these endpoints organically grew. Again, we're going to publish close to 400 of them in our first release, but we have a lot more, right, that we will be publishing as in our future releases. So that directory structure does not necessarily translate to how we want for those to be exposed to our new consumers, which are companies, businesses, integrating with consuming our APIs and powering their systems, either entirely so or partially, right? Just to hone what they already have, or maybe build everything from scratch, because you could literally do that using our API. So the first challenge one more time is how do you structure those endpoints on Postman? Not just Postman. Postman's just an end user sort of a developer experience, right? And it works fine. I want to say, like, I read about 95% of the API consumers actually use Postman or something along those lines. So that's pretty cool. And it gives me a lot of pride to say that the company's founders are folks who went to school, juniors, my juniors in college back in India and stuff. So it's awesome, right? So they built a great tool. But that doesn't sort of speak very well if you're a technical or a business product owner or a product manager. So we certainly want to be able to expose our API with rich documentation. I mean, it has to get richer as we go. Our first release is going to be rich enough, if you will, but we wanted to use a different tool. So we look for a different way to publish our documentation, API documentation and API references and guides and whatnot to the product owners, to maybe other roles, outside the developer and the architect, right? Maybe technical people, maybe non-technical folks, but people who are core part of the organization. For that, we looked long and hard, and I stumbled into something that, as it turns out, is already very popular, because sometimes you don't look for the brand name or whatever. It's like trying to find the best car, and it ends up being a Tesla Plaid or something. I don't know. Anyway, so this is a company called Readme, and if you're in the business of APIs, I'm pretty certain you already heard about them. They're very, very good. I love the way you can create the documentation. I mean, there's room for improvement just like everywhere. And I'll speak to each of those, the issues and the complexities and the scalability types of things that we have run into along the course of this challenge so far. But it's a great platform to publish APIs. So that's where our documentation is also going to be on. And I almost want to say primarily going to be on. So if you come to us wanting to consume our API, we'll ask you to go to maybe a couple of different places. Maybe one place is a starting point. It's going to link to a few different places because each of them does that particular job very well. So the core documentation is going to be pretty much on README, right? So Postman is one, README is the next. I mentioned Insomnia, but that's internal, so you can sort of discount it for the purposes of this conversation. Just remember two things so far in terms of other tools that you would actually have to get used to, right? Postman and README. Now that let's say you go figure out how to structure them, how to publish the documentation, and then when you go to README, you have like API references, you have something called recipes, you have something called guides, all kinds of documentation, and they have different plans to essentially support your needs, right? It starts with the basic, maybe a free plan or something, and then you go to the one that you actually at least need before you go live. And then if you want more, like if you want to be able to customize your HTML and CSS and do all of the cool stuff so your documentation stands out from the rest of the documentation, more power to you, right? They do have a plan that supports it. So that's essentially the second thing we need, README. What else do we need in this mix, right? Now let's say we have our endpoints, again, built internally for internal purposes that we are publishing. While the core functionality is extraordinarily useful, which is ultimately why we are actually publishing the API, the actual REST endpoints, the language, the verbiage, the way the actual endpoints were defined, and they are reasonably consistent, I want to say, given the fact that we didn't build all of them, design all of them on day one. It organically grew. But there are some nuances and differences, right? So we need to introduce a sense of consistency. We need to do some pre-processing to these endpoint requests, either at a single endpoint level or at the entire request level for the whole system as a whole, right? Similarly, we want to have post-processors either at the endpoint level or at the whole request response level, outside of it being endpoint agnostic, in other words, right? That's processing pre-post at different levels. And then any kind of massaging that needed to happen. In most cases, the API gateway would be a proxy where it receives a request, does whether pre-post processing and all the kind of data massaging, forwards the request to our API servers, and then gets a response back and sends it back to you as the client and the consumer, right? That's trivializing what it does, but that's the starting point. But what if there are some things we need to do that don't actually have to make their way to the core API server at all? And let's get into more complexities in the subsequent videos. So at 9 minutes in, at least, hopefully you get a bit more context into getting as far as what the other tools, peripheral tools that are needed, and the actual and the need for this gateway layer tier in between. In the next videos, let's pick up from here and actually dig a little bit deeper, right? That's about it. And remember to check out snowball.com so you'll see how an existing implementation is that has been consuming and leveraging these endpoints, right? Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.